1970s, we're going to talk about politics, economy, and culture. In the end of the 60s and in the early 70s, Richard Nixon was the President of America. During his presidency, many economical changes would erupt, questioning his leadership ability. In the early 70s, there would be a nationwide railroad strike and postal strike. This was all because of the money paid to them wasn't enough to suffice for the high rates of inflation. This became a political affair on who would regulate the economy. At this time, another huge embargo placed on the U.S. and the rest of the Western Hemisphere was OPEC embargo, also known as the Arab oil embargo. This hurt the United States politically because of their relationships with the Arab nations and the economy of the U.S. The main incident was that Nixon hurt was the Watergate scandal. He was so hungry to win that he went off to cheat so he could win. He wanted to know who he was going to run against, but this would hurt him, eventually leading to his resignation. On the positive side, Nixon and the United States at an all-time low for unemployment to 3.3%. He also improved relations with China and the USSR, or now Russia. A major help was when he pulled out America of the Vietnam War, saving thousands of American lives from injury and harm. After this, in 1974, he would be relieved by Gerald Ford, who won respect for colleagues in both parties for his honesty and unassuming manner. He would later pardon him of all his crimes, which would lead to his downfall of popularity from 72 to 49% at the end of his term. Ford clashed with Congress over domestic and foreign policy. During this term, U.S. and Soviet relations began to unravel. And now we're going to talk about economy. The oil embargo devastated the Western economy, including the Americans' economy. This would lead to the Americans having stagflation. Stagflation is a period with high rate of inflation combined with an economic recession. The gas prices would skyrocket, going from 35 cents a gallon in the beginning of 1970 to around 90 cents near the end of 1970s. The embargo would end less than a year later, in March of 1974, but the effects would stay till the end of the century. The inflation of the 1970s was terrible. There was a mix of high demand and a low supply of things such as jobs, houses, cars, and etc. The reason for this high inflation was because no one wanted to take office as the Federal Reserve Chairman. Also, many people underestimated the effects of the inflation problems. No one really had a mandate to stop the inflation either. So what happened was that the prices kept on rising and rising. Another thing that caused inflation was that the investors and creditors had no confidence in the banking system. The lack of credibility and commitment caused inflation to rise. Another reason for the poor economy was the high unemployment. The high unemployment was a result of the women workforce and a combination of returning soldiers from Vietnam. In 1969, the employment was around 80 million workers. By the end of the 70s, it was more than 96 million workers. And it went from 3.3% around unemployment to around 8% unemployment, nearly reaching another depression. It wasn't good, and it just got worse and worse until the 80s. Okay, now we're going to talk about culture. The chaotic events of the 60s, including war and social change, seemed destined to continue in the 70s. Major trends included a growing disappointment of government, advances in the civil rights, increased influence of the women's movement, a heightened concern for the environment, and increased space exploration. Many of the radical ideas of the 60s gained wider acceptance in the new decade and were mainstreamed into American life and culture. Amid war, social realignment, and presidential impeachment proceedings, American culture flourished. The events of the times became the inspiration for much of the music, entertainment, and even fashion of the decade. By the 1970s, the term rock and roll had become nearly meaningless. Within the decade, the Beatles broke up and Elvis Presley died, which were two major influences. Pop rock branched into many different styles, such as soft rock, hard rock, country rock, folk rock, punk, shock rock, and disco. Among the top names in popular music were Aerosmith, David Bowie, Alice Cooper, the Eagles, Billy Joel, Elton John, Led Zeppelin, John Lennon, Pink Floyd, Bob Seger, Bruce Springsteen, and The Who. Easy listening regained popularity with the groups like the Carpenters and Bob Marley, gained a huge core of fans in the U.S. performing Jamaican reggae music. Even though Michael Jackson was only 12 years old in 1970, his career as a solo performer skyrocketed during this decade. The fashion influence of the 1960s hippies was mainstream in the 70s. Men had hair to their shoulders, and non-traditional clothing became the rage, including bell-bottom pants, hip huggers, colorful patches, hot pants, platform shoes, earth shoes, clogs, t-shirts, and gypsy dresses. Knits and denims were the fabrics of choice. Leisure suits for men were normal, and women were fashionable in everything from ankle-length dresses to hot pants and miniskirts. The movie Annie Hall of 1977 inspired a fashion trend with women sporting traditional men's clothing such as derby hats, tweed jackets, and neckties worn with baggy pants or skirts. The 70s was a big comeback for the movies. Television came of age in the 70s as topics once considered taboo were broadcasted on the airwaves for the first time. Leading the way was the humorous social satire of All in the Family, which had plots on many controversial issues. Saturday Night Live also satirized topics and people once thought as off limits. Nothing was considered sacred. Television satellite news broadcasts from the front lines of the conflict in Vietnam continued to bring the horrors of the war into the homes of millions of Americans and intensified anti-war sentiment into the country. Sesame Street also became famous and was watched by many children.
Overall, the 70s was a combination of both good and bad times. They ranged all the way from a plummeting economy and an energy crisis to very famous music from artists such as Little Michael and the Beatles, making the 70s one of the most famous decades ever.